June 2nd, 1942. Mid-Pacific, aboard USS Hornet. The ocean stretched endlessly, blue and calm under the rising sun, as Lieutenant Commander John Waldron ran his hands along the fuselage of his TBF Avenger. The crew snorted around him, veterans of earlier skirmishes muttering about the ugly duckling of the carrier deck. The Avenger was slow compared to the SBD Dauntless, clunky compared to the nimble Wildcats, and its radar and torpedo systems still demanded meticulous checks before each sortie. Across the Pacific, Japanese reconnaissance had spotted American task forces, and within the grey steel decks of the Imperial Navy, officers laughed at the reports of this cumbersome torpedo bomber. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, sitting in his briefing room aboard Akagi, gestured toward crude sketches of the Avenger. "Slow, heavy, almost grotesque," he said. "How can such a machine threaten our carriers?" His aides snickered nervously, but Waldron felt no shame. Training had made him patient, and the aircraft's payload and range were unmatched when used correctly. On deck, the engines roared as planes were loaded, torpedoes strapped, fuel tanks topped off. Wind gusted across the flight deck, rattling the safety harnesses as the crew called out final checks. Waldron climbed into the cockpit, the canopy locking with a firm click, and stared at the horizon. He knew the Japanese would dismiss them, underestimate their capabilities, and he hoped that very dismissal would be their undoing. As the first Avenger rumbled forward, carrier deck lights gleaming, the roar of engines mixed with the pounding of his heart, signaling the start of an operation that would soon redefine naval warfare. June 4th, 1942, early morning, over the waters north of Midway Atoll. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, ascended from USS Hornet in a line of 6 Avengers, engines whining against the thin Pacific air. Below, Japanese destroyers and cruisers slipped into formation, unaware of the coming storm. The Avenger's bulky fuselage glinted under the rising sun, and on board, Waldron could see the tension in his pilot's eyes, the tight grip on throttles, and the beads of sweat forming despite the cool breeze. Radio silence pressed on them like a tangible weight. Every word spoken risked detection. Japanese fighters, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, swooped in, agile and deadly, their laughter and taunts heard only in the collective memory of the Americans' briefings. "Ugly birds," Waldron muttered under his breath, recalling the dismissive tone of enemy officers. "Let's show them ugly can bite." Torpedo 8 pressed forward, low over the waves, weaving as anti-aircraft fire erupted from the carrier's flak batteries. Explosions danced across the surface, water plumes soaring like twisted fountains. Waldron's heart raced, but he maintained formation, eyes locked on the distant silhouettes of Japanese carriers. One by one, the squadron's torpedoes streaked toward targets, a sacrificial hailstorm to break the enemy's defensive screen. The Avengers were hit. Several spiraled into the sea, torn apart by concentrated fire, but their persistence forced Japanese decks to maneuver, disrupting the protective formation around the carriers. Waldron could feel the weight of history pressing on him. Each second, each evasive maneuver, each exploding torpedo had the power to determine the fate of the Pacific. The so-called ugly Avengers were doing their work. Their bravery, combined with precise timing and the unrelenting press of technology, began to create chaos in the heart of the Japanese fleet. June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. Below the smoke and fire of the torpedo attack, the Japanese fleet reeled. Carrier decks heaved as gunners scrambled to track the incoming Avenger formations, their eyes wide with disbelief at the slow, deliberate approach of what they had called clumsy machines. The torpedoes didn't score massive hits, but the disruption was devastating. Ships twisted and turned, defensive coordination faltering under the pressure, and the carefully plotted formations that had made the Japanese Navy formidable were thrown into disarray. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida barked orders into his radio, trying to rally the fighters to plug the holes. But every command collided with the chaos Torpedo 8 had sown. Waldron, flying low over the waves, watched as Zeros tore into his squadron. Men screamed over the radio, machines shuddered under enemy fire, and yet they pressed on, knowing that their survival mattered less than the opportunity they were creating. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized that the American torpedo planes, so maligned for their appearance, were more than a nuisance. They were a force that could dictate movement, disrupt formations, and draw the defenders away from more critical threats. Amid the smoke, flak, and burning decks, Waldron's voice crackled through the squadron channel. "Hold steady. Keep your lines tight. Let them chase ghosts while the dive bombers do their work." As the Avengers descended and evaded, a tense anticipation gripped both sides. In the bowels of the carriers, crewmen watched the flight paths with terror and confusion. They had expected an easy engagement against slow, bulky aircraft, and instead found themselves reacting to every move of machines they had mocked only hours before. The ugly Avengers had rewritten the rules of engagement in real time, and the first cracks in Japan's naval supremacy began to appear. June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll, Pacific skies. With Torpedo 8 drawing the Zeros low and forcing the Japanese fleet into frantic maneuvers, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown streaked overhead, engines screaming and wings slicing through the early morning light. Bombs hung momentarily under the nose, then dropped in precise arcs as pilots gritted their teeth, counting seconds, altitude, and velocity with absolute focus. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were vulnerable now, their decks exposed, gunners diverted toward the lower-flying Avengers. Explosions tore through flight decks, smoke and flames rising into the sky, mingling with debris and shouts from the crews scrambling for survival. Waldron, still maneuvering his Avenger through flak and chasing Zeros, watched the destruction unfold below. Every hit the dive bombers scored was validation of their perilous sacrifice, proof that the slow and cumbersome TBFs had achieved their critical objective, breaking the enemy's defensive screen. Radios crackled with coordination and urgency as surviving Avengers signaled positions, corrected sightings, and drew attention to pockets of resistance. On the Japanese bridges, officers screamed into intercoms, trying to regain control, but each second spent reacting to Torpedo 8's advance and dodging bombs was a second lost, a hole in formation that could not be patched. By mid-morning, the four carriers were ablaze, smoke columns signaling not just destruction, but a dramatic reversal of fortune that no one aboard the Japanese ships could have predicted. Waldron banked his Avenger for a final pass over the burning Kaga, eyes scanning for threats, knowing that their mission, though costly, had changed the course of the Pacific War. The ugly Avengers, mocked only hours before, had become the pivot around which victory now turned. Type continued to generate Section 5. June 4th, 1942. Mid-Pacific, returning to the USS Hornet. The skies were still thick with smoke from the burning Japanese carriers, the acrid scent of aviation fuel and gunpowder hanging in the air as Waldron and the few surviving members of Torpedo 8 limped home. The cost had been catastrophic. Out of 15 Avengers that had launched, only one returned intact, engines smoking, wings scorched from flak. Waldron's hands shook as he guided the aircraft onto the pitching deck, the deck crew rushing to secure the plane. Around him, silence reigned, broken only by the clamor of medics attending the wounded and sailors staring in awe at the sky above, now quiet except for distant splashes where comrades had fallen. Debriefings later confirmed the impact. The Japanese defensive screen had been shattered, carriers destroyed, and the pathway for American dominance in the Pacific had been irrevocably widened. Waldron, exhausted and mourning the loss of his men, understood that the true legacy of Torpedo 8 lay not just in destruction, but in the courage displayed against insurmountable odds. The Avenger, once derided for its bulk and slowness, had proven that design, when paired with bravery and tactical purpose, could accomplish what speed and elegance alone could not. Among the surviving pilots, quiet conversations acknowledged the futility of personal fear in the face of duty. The TBF Avenger had become a symbol, a harbinger of the industrial and operational might of the United States Navy, and a living testament to those who had sacrificed everything to change the course of the Pacific War. News would spread, and the enemy would revise their calculations. But for that moment, the ugly Avenger had triumphed, embodying the brutal truth that sometimes it is the underestimated weapon that turns the tide. Type continued to generate Section 6, June 5, 1942, USS Enterprise, Midway Atoll. The aftermath of the battle hung over the carrier decks like a heavy fog, smoke drifting lazily from distant wrecks and shattered supply ships. Lieutenant Commander Waldron walked among the mechanics, pilots, and sailors, his eyes catching the battered Avengers still lined up on deck. Each aircraft bore scars of combat, flak pockmarks, scorched wings, and the twisted metal of torn fuselages. Yet despite the destruction, each plane stood as a testament to resilience, bravery, and the unexpected power of an aircraft once ridiculed. Reports filtered through the ship's radio rooms. Japanese forces were reeling, carrier strength decimated, and morale shattered. Across the Pacific, commanders who had mocked the TBF Avenger were now forced to reassess their assumptions. Intelligence confirmed the role Torpedo 8 had played in fracturing their defense. Officers who had once scoffed at the plane's design now recorded it in reports, noting its contribution to the destruction of 4 carriers and the opening of a strategic advantage for the Allies. Waldron watched the young pilots cleaning their bloodied hands and adjusting radios, realizing that the legacy of their sacrifice would extend beyond this one battle. The Avenger, slow and cumbersome in the eyes of the enemy, had become a symbol of American industrial ingenuity, strategic planning, and the willingness to use every tool, even an ugly one, to its full effect. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting golden light across the waves, Waldron felt a quiet satisfaction mingled with grief. The cost had been immense, but history had been altered, and the TBF Avenger, once scorned, would forever embody the lethal, calculated courage of the United States Navy. Type June 6, 1942. Debriefing room aboard USS Hornet. The surviving members of Torpedo 8 gathered around charts, maps, and battle reports, faces pale, voices hushed with fatigue and awe. Waldron, standing before them, traced the flight paths over Midway's waters with his finger, recounting every maneuver, every evasive turn, every torpedo dropped. "They called us slow, clumsy, easy targets," he said, voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "But we did what had to be done. We drew their fire, disrupted their formations, and made sure the dive bombers hit home." The pilots nodded, some wiping blood from their brows, some simply staring at the paper as if trying to comprehend the enormity of their actions. In Tokyo, the echoes of Midway were nothing less than humiliation. Japanese commanders, once mocking, now recognized the deadly impact of a force they had underestimated. The TBF Avenger, ugly and awkward in design, had become the fulcrum of victory, demonstrating that courage, timing, and the element of surprise could outmatch technical elegance and reputation. Historians would later note that the sacrifice of Torpedo 8 had allowed the US Navy to cripple the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet, a decisive moment in the Pacific War. Waldron's eyes swept the room one final time. The cost had been staggering, yet the lesson was indelible. In warfare, underestimation is often fatal, and even the most derided weapon can reshape history when wielded with resolve, precision, and unwavering courage.